Um, Tonight's presentation is part of the exhibit Women's Votes, Voters' Voices, which is showing in the Step Up Gallery at Mesa Public Library. Thank you for joining Los Alamos League of Women Voters and Los Alamos County Library System for tonight's presentation from Sylvia Ramos Cruz. Sylvia is a retired surgeon, general surgeon, poet, writer, and women's rights activist. She writes poems inspired by art, women's lives, and everyday injustices. She has roots in many places: Puerto Rico, New York, New Mexico. Her photographs and award-winning prose and poetry have appeared in local and national publications. Her present writing focuses on personal essays in the history of women suffrage and suffragists in New Mexico. And I also just wanted to let you know that there will be a third presentation that is part of this series associated with the exhibit in the Step Up Gallery. And that presentation is called La Nina, the story of Nina Otero Warren, and that will be at 6 p.m. on Thursday, September 16th. So please join me in welcoming Sylvia Ramos Cruz.
Thank you very much, Felicity. And thank you, all of you, for being here today. I want to thank the Mesa Library and the Los Alamos League of Women Voters for inviting me to share this history with you. This afternoon earlier, I saw the exhibit on women's suffrage in the library here, and I found it for me a wonderful refresher on the national movement for suffrage in this country. It had bits and pieces from other times, but mainly it reflected the 72 years it took for women in this country to get the vote. The panels really are very instructive. They're very clear. They have great illustrations. And two things, there were two period dresses and hats from that time. And those served really to place one in the moment and really bring the flesh and blood to the library hall where this is being presented. I have been researching the suffrage movement in New Mexico for the last few years. It has been especially hard to find information, especially information on the women who took part in this movement. They didn't write their own history for the most part, and they didn't speak about their work also once they achieved suffrage. They haven't been looked into very much. There's little research on them. And when publications about them have come out, really rarely is suffrage a big part of that story that's presented. Through my research, I have found that these were women of their times. They were shaped by the world and events around them, although they kept pushing against the limits imposed on them by society. They had strongly held beliefs and just as strongly held biases. They were pragmatic women with a hunger for the vote, and to that end, they sometimes compromised their principles. Most of these women were college educated and many were employed. They kept up with world events, scientific discoveries, and new ideas. In the fervor to improve communities, they sometimes were drawn to movements that were later discredited or repudiated. Two of these are the eugenics movement and the attempt to prohibit alcohol in this country. An example of the eugenics movement connection is the Better Babies contest that the Albuquerque Women's Club sponsored in 1914 at the state fair. I admire about these women that they believed in themselves. They believed in their ability to make change that would affect and better the lives of themselves, their children, their families, their communities. And I admire about them that they stuck together for almost 50 years here in New Mexico to bring to reality the dream they shared, despite political, economic, social, and religious differences. My talk today is a general view of the movement in New Mexico. I have other talks that do focus on the specific women suffragists, and I am happy to share those with you. If you email me, my email address will be on the title slide. I'm also hoping to learn more about suffrage and suffragists in New Mexico. So if any of you know anybody who was part of that movement or part of the history, I would appreciate hearing from you. And now I think we're going to go on and share the screen. Will they be seeing that side? Can we
No.
get rid of that side?
Yeah, if you want it.
Let's just do that one.
Okay. There we go.
Perfect. Let me go back. Okay. Any way I can move this up to this corner? I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's see if we can get rid of that. We don't actually want you in the image, but I guess, is that okay? Does that look all right?
It doesn't matter. I like to, anyway, it'll be okay. Yes. By the time Carrie Chapman Catt arrived at the station in 1919, she and many other suffragists have gone across the country for many, many years. At least 72 years, if we date the movement back to the 1948 Suffrage Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. That conference was called by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And out of that came their Declaration of Sentiments. All men and women are created equal. That rang out as a clarion call to women across the nation. And you may see the full speech that Elizabeth Cady Stanton gave at that conference in the library here in the suffrage exhibit. From the beginning, many more women joined the movement, and among them was Susan B. Anthony. She had voted in 1872, or at least had attempted to vote, but was arrested and fined for voting without the legal right to vote. She never paid that fine, but instead she wrote the 19th Amendment in 1878 to get women's right to vote into the Constitution. And then she had it introduced into Congress by Senator Aaron Sargent, whose picture you will see in the exhibit here also. Alice Paul joined the campaign in 1912 when she returned from studies in England. She was fired up by the work that she had done with Emmeline Pankhurst to get women in England to vote. In fact, a newspaper of the time in 1909 in England credited her for inventing the hunger strike. Suffragists traveled on foot, horses, carts, wagons, cars, and of course, steam locomotives under all kinds of conditions. When Carrie Chapman Catt arrived at the Albuquerque station on December 3rd, 1919, she had been on a tour of Western states since October, and she had survived and led her troops through a bout of the influenza during the 1918 pandemic. How had Carrie Chapman Catt and New Mexico arrived at that moment, the eve of ratification of the 19th Amendment? By 1920, the state's population was over 360,000 people. 83% lived in rural communities, and 48.5% were non-English speakers. Among the women, Nuevo Mexicanas were 56%, Euro-Americans 37%, Native Americans 6%, African Americans less than 1%, and Asians were much less than 1% of the women at that time in New Mexico. As with any major change in history, a confluence of events leads to that moment. I believe that for suffrage, there were 5 such events. The suffrage movement in New Mexico grew out of the same sentiments that compelled Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony to launch the effort. It grew from women's desire to have their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness acknowledged, from women's desire to be recognized as capable of participating equally in the government that ruled their civic lives. capable of tackling needs they saw in their communities in areas such as public education, hygiene, libraries, alcohol abuse, and lynching. It grew from knowing that their fathers, husbands, and male relatives did not see the world quite as they did and should not and did not and would not cast the ballot at the ballot box for them. It grew from a realization that no matter how carefully they had studied a topic and how thoughtfully they had presented an agenda for change, politicians were unwilling to listen to a group that had no vote. In the end, women had to get the ballot themselves, and they set out to doing it. It's true that at the turn of the 20th century, many women really were either opposed to suffrage or relatively indifferent to being able to vote. The demand for suffrage was mainly among the middle-class women from families engaged in professions, trades, and commerce, and educated women who lived in the cities and developing suburbs. Farm women and city immigrant women were less interested in suffrage and less responsive to the calls. We can all think about why that might be. They were probably engaged in just trying to survive. But many women around the country did join the women's clubs movement and join their clubs in their particular areas. In New Mexico, as in the rest of the country, all types of New Mexico of women's clubs developed. It was common at that time for many men's organizations to have a ladies' auxiliaries to help with ceremonies and fundraising functions. In Las Vegas, several women wanted to be more than auxiliaries. They organized their own club, a branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, in 1885. The first non-temperance related club in New Mexico may be a chapter of Soros's that was in East Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1887. The members convened regularly to present original articles and poems to distribute, and also to distribute reading lists to the membership. Perhaps members of the Temperance Union, Soros's Club, or the Women's Federation that developed in Las Vegas in 1903 were in this automobile going to the suffrage parade of one sort or another. If you know who these ladies are or anything about suffrage in New Mexico, again, I'd appreciate your letting me know. The Albuquerque Women's Club was founded in 1903 by several ladies for the betterment of women morally and intellectually. They were all admirers of Susan B. Anthony. The 1953 50th anniversary booklet of the Albuquerque Women's Club gives insight into the club's activities over 50 years. I recently learned that the club was finally dissolved in 2013 due to diminishing membership. It was disbanded 110 years after it began and after having served the community for all of that time. The booklet was written by Maud McPhee Bloom, a suffragist who is noted for her work in the 6th volume of the History of Women's Suffrage, published in 1922. In fact, 42 New Mexico women are named in that booklet. 9 of those women were members of the Albuquerque Women's Club. The first year they enrolled 84 charter members, of whom 6 had Hispanic surnames. The booklet notes that the charter members roster was kept open for 6 weeks to serve women both up and down the Rio Grande. I interpret that to mean that they wanted to attract Hispanas. Among the women who joined during that time were Mrs. Solomon Luna, Mrs. Evie Chavez, Mrs. Felix Vaca. Later, the wife of Governor Octaviano Larrazolo joined the club. And some of you may know that the first woman to become Secretary of State in New Mexico, Soledad Chavez Chacon, was a member of the club. The Silver City Women's Club began as the Mothers Club in 1909. It is still active and engaged in community outreach projects such as scholarships, food drives, school vision, and hearing test programs. By 1911, When women's clubs consolidated in New Mexico Federation of Women's Clubs, there were 11 such clubs in New Mexico. Many of the clubs were involved in what was called, perhaps derogatorily, maternalistic or homemaking politics, issues of infant and child health, child and family welfare, public health and safety. Eventually, all of these clubs would come to advocate for women's rights while still working on traditional women's activities and interests. At this point, it is important to note that, as in the clubs and suffrage organizations around the United States, New Mexico club members were mainly Euro-American women, middle-class, well-educated, well-connected, influential women married to influential men. In smaller towns, there were more working-class women and perhaps more Hispanas. Because they worked for reform through these de facto segregated organizations, club women didn't get to know about or collaborate with Hispanic and other New Mexico women who worked in their own communities for civic reforms through churches, tribal groups, and family associations. Club members therefore lost out on the political influence that Hispanas and other women of color may have had on their male relatives, and they had the vote. Black women in New Mexico founded their own federation of clubs that sometimes allied with Anglo clubs to work on specific projects. In 1914, the Home Circle Club was founded by Mrs. Lula Black. She was an educator. She was joined by 8 matrons to better prepare themselves for their duties as mothers and social leaders in their community. Among its agenda were children's education, prohibition, suffrage, and lynching. It was one of 5 or 6 colored women's clubs in Albuquerque. Other African-American women's clubs in communities such as Blackdom, near Artesia, tackled issues of sovereignty, as well as education and town services. The Home Circle Club is still alive and well 107 years later. It still provides scholarships to college students. From the beginning, women's organizations had partnered with sympathetic organizations run by men to get their agenda considered by politicians. But that was not a viable long-term strategy, nor a just one. As happened nationally, women in New Mexico realized that to achieve reform, they needed to win the right to vote. In 1900, women's clubs and suffrage organizations came together, and the women's suffrage movement really became a mass movement and a steady march. There had been votes for suffrage in the New Mexico legislature in 1874 and 1895, but they were defeated. By 1890, the Women's Christian Temperance Union had a department devoted to suffrage under Ada McPherson Morley, who had proposed the idea. She was a rancher from Datil, who was also a member of the Albuquerque Women's Club. Although much effort went into this mission, the main concerns for women outside the home in New Mexico at that time were statehood and prohibition. In 1896, the Territorial Equal Suffrage Association was formed. The parents of Maud McPhee Bloom were listed as advocates of the organization. You may see Maud standing in the middle and her father and mother at the sides and her siblings sitting. I must note that throughout the suffrage movement, there were men involved in it too. There were many suffragists who were also men. In 1899, Carrie Chapman Catt came for the first time to New Mexico to reorganize the Suffrage Association and enroll new members. From that organization came the New Mexico chapter of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. Among its members were Dr. Margaret Cartwright, a prominent Albuquerque physician, founder of the YWCA in Albuquerque in 1910. Other members were Ina Sizer Cassidy, a Santa Fe suffragist and the first president of the League of Women Voters in New Mexico. Deanne Lindsay, the governor's wife, was also in that suffrage organization, and she went on to hold several leadership roles in not only women's clubs, but suffrage organizations throughout the years. Despite the work to organize and having members willing to work for the cause, not much help was given to New Mexico by the national organization. Carrie Chapman Catt had realized that it was almost impossible to change the voting laws in New Mexico by changing the Constitution. Therefore, her strategy, which was to win suffrage by having it won in every state, would not work here. No matter the challenges, suffrage work got done. In 1900, the newly formed association sent a letter to the Republican and Democratic parties to ask for suffrage in all matters pertaining to our public schools. They stated that women had the principal task of caring for and teaching the young, and that women in Arizona and Oklahoma already had such vote. In 1905, the Santa Fe New Mexican reported that a woman's suffrage bill had appeared in the legislature. Referring to suffrage, a legislator's response had been, "Women simply do not want it. Whenever they do want it, the male citizens of New Mexico will be gallant enough to give it to them." Well, they did want it, but they didn't get it for 15 years more. Solomon Luna was the most powerful Republican in the Territorial Convention in 1910. He was a sheep rancher, banker, Republican National Committee man, and state leader. He supported school suffrage for women, and he encouraged his niece, Nina Otero Warren, or Adelina Otero Warren, to work for it. Just before the Constitutional Convention opened in 1910, the Temperance Union sponsored a debate in Mountain Air on the question of the ballot for women. That may have been the very first time New Mexicans ever argued this issue in public. Also in 1910, the Albuquerque Women's Club sent a letter asking the Constitutional Convention members to extend the franchise to women in all school questions. Women had decided that they probably could get the suffrage for school matters, but they were not going to get it yet for suffrage to vote for all elected candidates. So they just went for the school suffrage, and actually they were successful. They could vote for school trustees, on bond issues, and in the local administration of the schools, but not for superintendents. Meanwhile, women were making inroads in their campaign for a greater voice in politics and acceptance of the work outside the home. At the Industrial Day Parade that closed the State Fair in 1914, women's clubs marched in the 3rd Division, which also had a women's suffrage float. A 28-second snippet of film in the Albuquerque Museum photo archives and shows really enthusiastic crowds lining the road while women went by in cars sporting Women's Christian Temperance Union signs and Votes for Women signs. And also, whichever baby won the Better Babies contest that year followed in the Better Babies float. So here is a snippet of that. Here's that snippet of film. As you see, there's a lot of people, mostly men we see lining the road, but here comes the Votes for Women car full of women, of course, and another car full of women following them. And everybody seems to be having a great time. And at least as far as I can see, nobody was throwing any tomatoes at the women who were asking for the vote. I'll play that again because it goes pretty fast. But it's an interesting scene of the times. The YMCA had about 150 people. The Women's Christian Temperance Union had a car and a cart. I don't know what the men signs on those bicycles say. And here's the Votes for Women. And somewhere in there came the better baby in that float. Women continued to join the suffrage associations while also working for suffrage through various other women's clubs. An example is Deanne Lindsay, who held several leadership positions, including president in women's clubs and suffrage organizations. Sorry, okay, there we are. The bifurcation of strategies, state versus national campaigns, kept the public's attention on suffrage. Newspaper carried stories about their activities and controversies all the time. Although initially Carrie Chapman Catt's organization and Alice Paul Congressional Union had worked together, in 1914, they parted company based on strategy and tactics. Catt focused on the ratification in the states, and she was willing to accept partial suffrage. Her members were moderate in their tactics and had the ears of presidents, Congress, and business. The Women's Suffrage Association had a large organization, and by the end of the campaign in 1920, had 2 million volunteers fanned across the country. And its publishing company had published 50 million pieces of literature during that time. Alice Paul focused on Congress, as it had to pass the federal amendment before it could be sent to the states for ratification. A federal amendment, she thought, would set equal qualifications for voters in every state. Therefore, individual states could not impose different requirements for voter registration based on racial, socioeconomic, or educational status. The Congressional Union members lobbied the president and Congress. They also held more militant public events that garnered the attention and many times the sympathy of the public. They kept suffrage and suffragists in the news. Still, the Congressional Union needed state suffragists to lobby congressmen in person when they were in the states, and then deluge them with letters when they were in Washington, D.C. In 1914, the first organizers for the Congressional Union arrived and began to organize through the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The Temperance Union had already endorsed suffrage the national one had endorsed suffrage in the late 1870s on the grounds that women needed the vote to protect themselves and their families from alcohol and other vices. A Congressional Union organizer attended the Temperance Convention in July 1915 and urged women to begin a letter writing campaign asking senators and representatives for the vote. Many women took up the call, including Ada McPherson Morley. She had begun writing letters to her elected officials to sway and sometimes castigate them. And she continued that practice well into her later years. By February 1916, Deanne Lindsay, who had also joined the letter writing campaign, complained to Ada Morley, "I think Senator Catron has been stormed and stormed about the suffrage matter. The Santa Fe women have written and written to no avail." To access a more powerful base of socially prominent women, the Congressional Union shifted its attention to club women, especially Santa Fe club women. It worked through the state federation to recruit women to the suffrage campaign throughout the state. By 1915, the Congressional Union enjoyed a committed network of support, especially among middle-class and elite Anglo club women in urban areas. But organizers, realizing that the majority of the state's women were Hispanas, began to reach out to them. Ella St. Clair Thompson wrote to Alice Paul from New Mexico, "They say it is very difficult to get the Spanish ladies out, but as I have one on the program to speak in Spanish, I think they will come, and their husbands as well." Her efforts to reach out to Spanish-speaking women paid off, especially among the elite women relatives of influential politicians in New Mexico. Two nieces of Solomon Luna, Adelina Otero Warren and Aurora Lucero, who had been a noted orator when she was even in grade school, became active in the campaign and helped lead Nuevo Mexicanas into the political mainstream. Bilingual flyers and speeches in Spanish at public rallies brought support for suffrage among both women and men in the Hispanic community. In 1915, 150 suffragists went on a car caravan to the home of Senator Catron. He chaired the Senate's Select Committee on Women's Suffrage, though he was opposed to it. 4 women, Aurora Lucero, Arabella Romero, Julia Brown Asplund, and Ella St. Clair Thompson made brief speeches at Senator Catron's home. Lucero, a school teacher in Tucumcari and a skilled orator since grade school, led and gave the political point of view of the Spanish American woman. She said, "I speak for the Spanish American women who, while conservative, want the best possible laws when their home life is the question at issue. I represent the daughters of the conquistadores who first reclaimed this country from the wilderness and all the other women of the state. Note the disregard of indigenous people who were here long before the Spaniards came." Julia Brown Asplund, university and state librarian, spoke about women property owners and landowners, how unjust it was that they were being taxed without representation, a sentiment and cry that goes back to the Revolutionary War. But of course, back then it was men doing the crying, so they were listened to. But this time it didn't work. As newspapers reported, Senator Catron could not accommodate them. He said they were the weaker sex, designed to bear children. Men were the hardy people and the providers. Women could be soiled by politics. Ladies wouldn't vote, and only lower class women would. Women had to wait until Catron was defeated a year later, and Andreas Jones from Las Vegas became senator. All New Mexico congressmen after that were for suffrage. And as they continued to work, anti-suffragist ridicule continued. A word here about suffragettes. Suffragette is the term that was given derogatorily to women in England who wanted the vote. They decided to adopt the term and wore it proudly. In the United States, men and women who work for the vote are usually termed suffragists. Though they began organizing in 1914, the official New Mexico chapter of the Congressional Union for Suffrage formed in 1916, and some of the state officers at that time were Nina Otero Warren, Mary Steele McPhee, and Julia Brown Asplund. According to Joan Jensen, the affiliations of some New Mexico suffragists at that time were Congressional Union 80, the Suffrage Association 30, the Federation of Women's Clubs 25, the Christian Temperance Union members 9. Political party affiliations for those suffragists were Republican 20, Democrats 4, and Socialist 1. Though all suffragists nationally were accused of being Bolshevists at one time or another. And the March for Suffrage continued. In 1917, the conventions of both political parties in New Mexico declared in favor of women's suffrage. Before the legislative session, there was a strategy meeting in Washington, Governor Washington Lindsay's office at the Capitol that was attended by many men and women who had worked on this for years. Despite their work, as the Albuquerque Morning Journal reported, suffrage lost by just a little. Disappointing, yet hopeful. By that time, Otero Warren enjoyed such a loyal following that she was chosen by Alice Paul to lead the state's branch of the Congressional Union. Her mission was to bombard our congressional representatives in Washington, D.C. with letters and with visits to win their support for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And then once she won the support of the Congress in Washington, she had to get the support of the New Mexico legislature and get the ratification in New Mexico. Those were two really enormous tasks but she proved very well up to the task. World War I gave women the opportunity to show that they could do men's work while also doing their own work. They answered the president's call to take over jobs men had left behind when they went to war. Suffragists led women's war effort nationally through the Women's Committee of the Council on National Defense, and in New Mexico, where Deanne Lindsay was the head. In July 1918, Isabella Ferguson was named by Governor Lindsay to head the Women's Land Army for the whole state. Over 500 women joined the Land Army. They were paid $2 a day plus room and board. Working conditions were harsh, 10-hour days in sometimes weather that went over 105 degrees. And at the end of the bed, sometimes no beds of the day, sometimes no, and at the end of the day, sometimes no beds, just alfalfa or pine boughs to lie on. Yet much to the delight and sometimes surprise of the farmers they were helping, they got the job done. 20 women harvested 30 acres of alfalfa in 4 days. In another location, 8 women moved, raked, and stacked 16 tons of hay. And still they smiled, laughed, played, and survived. Isabella was a hands-on manager who pitched in to help wherever she was needed, driving tractors, raking hay, picking fruit. She was a farmerette's farmerette. And she helped nurse some of the volunteers who came down with influenza until they could be moved to the hospitals. As we remember, that was during the what is called the Spanish flu, that is a misnomer, the flu pandemic of 1918. By August 1918, the Silver City Enterprise newspaper announced, Women's Land Army saves fruit on the Gila. Back in Washington, the militants' campaign continued through the war, and New Mexicans kept track of it. In June 1917, El Nuevo Mexicano newspaper reported that White House pickets were attacked by a mob of men over a handwritten flag that said the U.S. has no democracy since 20 million women are denied the vote. Another flag referred to the President Wilson, as Kaiser Wilson. Men yelled, "This is treason, you are traitors," and ripped the flags. Some women were injured and many were arrested. The difference in philosophy and strategy of the moderate and the militant suffrage groups in New Mexico sometimes erupted into arguments, as it did over that story. Mrs. Asplund hosted Ann Martin, who brought flags that had been at the White House picket. Martin had been arrested, convicted, and jailed. The president pardoned her and other suffragists after 3 days. A big celebration took place in the Santa Fe courthouse. On the same page of the newspaper was a story that Mrs. Lindsay, governor's wife, teacher, and lifelong reformer, had sent a letter to President Wilson expressing her and New Mexicans' disapproval of these tactics. He telegraphed thanking her. And the march continued. Over his 2-year term as governor, Lindsay and Mrs. Lindsay hosted many meetings of suffrage forces at the state capitol to strategize the best ways to get the legislators to pass it. And suffragists continued to petition the president to lend his support. Cora Kellum visited the president and Mrs. Wilson in the White House. Excuse me. While there, she told him, women in the states are growing restless, waiting for this amendment. They are eagerly awaiting action on this issue in the Senate. Won't you help us? The president said, I will, and he did. 2 months before the end of the war, President Wilson went to the Capitol to urge senators to vote for it. He stressed the importance of women's work in the war and asked that they grant women the vote as a war measure. We have made partners of women in the war, he said. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? Under the leadership of Senator Jones, the Senate voted favorably in June 1919, 50 years after its introduction in Congress. It was sent to the states for ratification. Suffrage Association members and Congressional Union members immediately began to lobby their state legislatures. By this time, referenda across the country on the subject of women's suffrage showed support for women's suffrage in 3/4 of the states. So women had changed minds, the minds of most of the population by the time 1920 came. Governor Larrazolo was a supporter of suffrage. He had been angered when the legislature failed to act on this subject in the regular session in 1919. He was being bombarded with handwritten and typed letters and telegrams for and against suffrage from national and local groups and individual citizens. Letters also went to the legislature about women's work during the war. The suffrage committee made the case that women had taken on responsibilities and made sacrifices in the war effort. They paid taxes without representation and still had no say in politics, even to adjust the cost of living that impacted women the most. At this point, 72 years into the national campaign, for the long working day, for the taxes we pay, for the laws we obey, we want something to say. Women wanted something to say. Carrie Chapman Catt came back to New Mexico in 1919, 20 years after her first trip here. She came to ask the governor for a special session of the legislature. She spoke before huge crowds and got ovations in several places. She spoke at the Albuquerque Women's Club, which by then was presided over by Mrs. Felix Vaca. She spoke at the Albuquerque YMCA and the Albuquerque Rotary Club. That was the first time women were entertained at the Rotary Club since it had been founded in 1916. Rotarians were sold on the justice of having women vote, and immediately they sent a telegram to the governor. Governor Larrazolo responded by calling for a special session of the legislature to ratify the amendment and amend the New Mexico Constitution to include women's suffrage. By the time Nina Otero Warren began her last push with Republican leaders to get them behind the amendment in January 1919, the groundwork had been laid by the hundreds of New Mexico women who had worked tirelessly for this moment for 46 years. They had shown their ability to organize, to lead, to get things done at home, in the community, in factories and farms. Minds had been open to the idea that all men and women are indeed created equal. Even before the special session convened in February 1920, women's achievements through activism prior to winning the vote were being recognized. The 1920 Estancia News Herald in January cataloged the accomplishments of New Mexico women in public life that already had achieved and previewed that the women had already achieved, and then it previewed how they would use the vote. It referenced especially Deanne Lindsay, Cora Kellum, and Nina Otero Warren. Among the causes they had advocated for and won were school suffrage for women. It raised the age of consent for girls from 10 to 14 years of age. They had obtained women's rights in marriage, child welfare and girls' welfare boards, prohibition, and the State Department of Health. Despite all of those accomplishments, as Otero Warren marshaled her forces, there were anti-suffrage forces, including the Catholic Church, still working to thwart the effort through allies in the legislature. When the time came for the final debate, on February 19, 1920, women packed the Senate galleries. The Senate ratified it, but the House balked at passing the amendment. Otero Warren spent 3 hours in the Republican caucus, the first time a woman had been allowed into such deliberations. In the end, the House ratified the amendment. The Senate was 77% for it, the House 78%. Bare majorities, but what was required to send the amendment to the public for their vote. And these 26 words had taken more than 46 years of concerted effort to be approved. Just 26 words. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Old Town historian Emma Moya told me that for women in Old Town, voting was very important. These are not Old Town women, but it's a good photo of women in cars celebrating. Elections were very festive in Old Town also, and women who had access to cars would drive around picking other women up to take them to vote. I don't know whether Soledad Armijo Chavez Chacon was one of those Old Town women who drove the car or was driven. I do know that she was elected New Mexico's first woman Secretary of State in 1922. And she served as New Mexico's and the country's first woman governor when she acted as chief executive while Governor Hinkle was out of the state for a month in 1924. And this happened because women across this country fought for 72 years to have their voices heard, to have a say in what goes on. Despite this, as we celebrate women winning the vote in 1920, it's important to remember that though the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution applies to all women citizens of the United States, many groups were not enfranchised, and some who were had no access to the ballot box nationally or in New Mexico for many years. That included many men also. Native Americans became citizens in 1924. Educated Puerto Rican women could vote in 1929, but all the rest only got the vote in 1935. The repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943 meant that Asian citizens could vote. And in 1948, Miguel Trujillo won voting rights for Native Americans in New Mexico and Arizona. And of course, the 1965 Voting Rights Act banned restrictive state laws about who could vote. Despite that, as we know, even today, voting rights are under attack. So our march for universal suffrage in the United States continues. Democracy begins at home, and to ensure democracy, we must vote, vote, and vote again. Many people have helped me do this research, too many to mention, but I believe they are all here on this slide. It was hard work, especially during the pandemic, and we did a lot of the work online through digital archives, and I want to thank them all from the bottom of my heart. I am still researching, so the rest of you out there still have an opportunity to help me and get your names on this slide. Thank you very much. And I am happy now to entertain questions.
Wow, can I just say what a fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
That was amazing.
Thank you, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and so yes, I imagine that there are probably just a million questions and comments. So if people would like to write their comments, that would be great. JJ Mortensen has raised her hand. JJ, actually, do you want to just go ahead and speak out? We could also do it that way. We could raise hands if people know how to do that. You can do that by going to the reactions, the little smiley face button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. JJ, go ahead.
Hello, you mentioned, perhaps half of the 42 New Mexico women in volume 6 of the History of suffrage. Besides Nina Otero Warren, which other New Mexican women suffragists do you think were the most influential?
Well, I think Ada McPherson Morley is the first suffragist I've really identified, and she really kept up her work throughout her life. She wrote letters, made the public aware of what was needed to win the vote for women. So Ada McPherson Morley, Deanne Lindsay, she was involved in every kind of organization that had to do with women's votes. So she organized a lot of rallies and events. Aurora Lucero, for sure, because she, along with Otero Warren, brought the Spanish-speaking women into the movement. Cora Kellum, because she traveled many times back and forth to Washington. These women would get into these iron horses, right? There was no air conditioning. They had these incredible costumes. Oh, the costumes here in the library are terrific. The costumes these women wore were long and hot, and how they went back and forth from here to Washington, D.C. to speak with legislators, the Congress people, and even the president is a marvel to me. And she did that several times. And I happen to admire her also because once the suffrage was won, she joined Alice Paul in trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment that we are still trying to get into the Constitution. There are so many women, and so many of them are really unknown yet. So that's why I'm so enthused about at least I have the names of at least more than 100 women who were involved in the movement. But whether I will ever find more than just their names, it's really hard to answer. So I think they were all important. Every single person who wrote leaflets, who set up the chairs at the convention hall so they could have the meeting, who provided the tea and the cookies. Every single person is involved in winning any cause. It starts perhaps with one, but it takes a village of women, in this case, to get it done.
Thank you.
Gosh, I could ask a question.
Please.
Which is, I have discussed this issue around the school board elections and how to increase turnout for the school board elections. And so it was great to hear your explanation of why we have these separate school board elections, which is that women, women's suffrage came first through the school board. And it's kind of like an unresolved issue in a way in New Mexico.
And it's imperative that we all vote for every single post of elected officials in a state, from the lowest post, which is actually not the lowest because they're just as important in the function that they serve, but from the smallest kind of post that you might think of to the highest one. We need to be involved because we want people in office who will answer to us, not answer to the people who are funding them and organizations who do that. So voting is a fundamental right. And it saddens me that although we've had it for 101 years now, we have not used this as wisely as we should have. Otherwise, we would already have 51% of all elected offices in the country be run by women, right? If we had used our votes wisely, we would have been electing women from the start. And we did. An amazing number of women were elected in that 1922 election across the country and in New Mexico. And we had a lot of opportunity to do that. So I really respect the League of Women Voters for the work they do and keep doing despite, legal challenges and manpower, woman power issues. I noticed that at most of these meetings, most of us who are there are already in the older generation. We have to figure out how to bring the young people on board to vote, because voting is a fundamental right of citizenship, but also it's not only a right, but a responsibility. And we have to get the young people engaged in that.
Do you have any other questions that people would like to raise hand? Oh, JJ has another question. Go ahead, JJ, or feel free to type your questions or comments into the chat also. Go ahead, JJ. Oh. Becky here also has a question. Tell us where the ERA stands now.
The ERA. So it has finally been ratified by the necessary states, which are the 38 states. The last state to ratify it was Virginia in January 2020. It went from there to the U.S. archivist who records such happenings. And once the archivist had accepted it, it would have gone into the Constitution. But the archivist did not accept it. There was a different administration in Washington, and they were not supportive of women getting equal rights in this country. So what's happened is that challenges in the court are ongoing, especially by an organization called Equal Means Equal, who's been doing a lot of work around the country to get women to vote. Also the ERA Coalition, the National Organization for Women, and many other organizations are working to get the archivist to accept the last 3 ratifications into the Constitution. And now we've been working on asking the president and the vice president, Kamala Harris, to, well, she doesn't have the power, but the president would have the power to ask the archivist to accept the ratification. He hasn't done that yet, even though both he and Vice President Harris expressed total support of the Equal Rights Amendment. That has not yet been done. So that's where we are.
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay. I am really thankful, Sylvia, that you addressed the full spectrum of in New Mexico as well as nationally. You gave the list of how voting rights came for Native Americans and like the Exclusion Act. So I really appreciate your thoroughness in addressing that. Thank you.
Well, you know, if one of us can't vote, then the democracy is not a true democracy. It's only when we have universal suffrage, not only the ability to vote, but then also the opportunity to vote and the venues available and the support of legislators instead of legislators who write laws against allowing people to vote for one or another cause that are spurious.
Okay, there is another question. It says, tell us how you as a physician became interested in women's suffrage.
Yes, I've always been interested in women's history. You know, women's stories are essential, and we've kept them alive through telling each other the stories, families or friends, because they haven't been written into the history books. And the first time I went into looking into that was, I think, in 1989, when I wrote and surveyed women surgeons in the United States. I wanted to find out more about them. Who were they? How did they get to that point? How were they doing in their lives? How was discrimination on the basis of gender affecting them? And then I published the results, but then my whole life got very busy. And it wasn't until I retired, which I did 5 years ago, and learned that although there are over 600 history markers in New Mexico, and you've seen them all, the roads in New Mexico, in every county, there are at least a couple of markers that tell you about the community or a person in that community. But of those over 600, very few had anything to do with women. There was Doña Ana County that you could count as for a woman, but really it wasn't really celebrating the woman per se. So the woman commission was established to suggest women to be put on those markers. And out of that commission, I think initially 72 women were nominated, and the markers went up. So being interested in women's history, and I love driving. I decided, well, I'm going to drive to see all of those markers because they have women's history in them, and I want to see what's going on, and then I would write about them. And then while doing that, I realized, like in 2018 at the beginning, that 100th anniversary of suffrage was coming along. And I knew more about the national suffrage movement than I knew about it, the movement in New Mexico, which was nothing. I knew nothing about the movement here. So I decided, well, I'm going to look into this. It should be an interesting project. And it has been. It has been a wonderful experience. Of course, I am not a trained historian. I guess now by now I'm an amateur historian, but I love doing the work and bringing out the stories of these women. It's so important to keep them alive for younger people.
And there is one last question, and then maybe we'll close the session.
Certainly, yes. Thank you very much for all your attention and questions.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention again that there will be another event upcoming in this series, which will be on Thursday, October 16th. La Nina, the story of Nina Otero Warren. And you can register for that on the library events calendar. And Marguerite Kearns asks, Sylvia, what keeps you going? What inspires you to keep digging into it?
Just the stories. It's like a mystery, you know. I will get a little piece of information in one place, and then it connects to something else that I happen to be looking into. And the fact that it's important to tell these women's stories. So that keeps me going. I guess I was a surgeon. So surgeons, you know, you see a patient, you try to figure, in the old days, you examine them, you try to figure out what's going on with them without all of the different tests that they have now. And you're like a detective following the clues. Okay, this is the story. This is what I find on examination. And now I'm going to find out what the real problem is when I, you know, do the operation. So I guess in some ways I've always been a detective and trying to solve mysteries. And this to me is like a mystery kind of road, you know, unraveling this history, or maybe raveling as it may be. So just that, Marguerite, and thank you for coming. I did see your name, and you have a wonderful book that everyone should know about, I think it's your grandmother, is that right? Edna Kearns?
Yes, it's my grandmother, and she passed the torch, as I think we're all doing. We're passing the torch to people that maybe know about the suffrage movement or don't know about it. Sylvia's been passing the torch. The work that you've been doing, the primary documents I've seen tonight are absolutely outstanding. And I was curious about, has anyone come forward, you know, here in New Mexico, to tell you stories that you didn't know before?
Actually, this is interesting. They haven't come. Yes, well, one is Dr. John Porter Bloom. Actually, he's the son of Maud McPhee Bloom. Remember, she's the suffragist who wrote the booklet for the Albuquerque Women's Club. So I reached out to him, and he very kindly invited me to come to his home and look through her file drawers of information. So that was great to, you know, to have that connection there. And then when Nina Otero Warren was being considered to have her image in the quarters, a niece of hers reached out to me to find out what I knew and maybe refer her to others. So only those two people have. But I would love to hear from anybody who has any information. Yeah, I mean, those personal kinds of connections are so much fun as opposed to going into the archives, you know, and digging through the books. And that's also fun. I mean, you know, I'm a reader, so I like doing that. But having that connection to Dr. John Porter Bloom and then to Nina Otero Warren's niece, that was terrific. I wanted to add one thing. Is the program on La Nina going to be done by Deborah Blanche?
Yes.
Well, Deborah Blanche, if you don't know her, is a wonderful actor. And I have seen her personification of Nina Otero Warren. She is terrific. And you know, you should take the opportunity to see her doing that. It's too bad it cannot be in person, as far as I can see, but you should see it because she really brings Nina to life.
Yeah. So should I go ahead and close this?
Yes,
session?
I think I want to thank you all for remaining here through your dinner hours. And I hope you will come to the library to see the exhibit here. And if you have any questions, anything comes up in the middle of the night for you, send me an email. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.